Coming up, she finally broke her silence. This week, Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty started talking about the sexual abuse scandal in her Washington, D.C. office. We went to Washington to speak with Esty to find out why she rewarded her former chief of staff with a severance deal instead of firing him immediately. She has decided not to run for re-election, but is that enough? UConn political professor Ron Schurin weighs in. Plus, the fight to be governor. A crowded race. Republican candidate Mike Handler tells us why he's the man for the job. And our flashback. Hear what Connecticut Senator Abe Ribicoff had to say about gun control in 1968 after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. It's Sunday, April 15th, 2018. Face the State starts now.
From Eyewitness News, Connecticut's most watched local political program, this is Face the State.
To say the least, this has been a rough ride for Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty. The three-term Congresswoman will not seek re-election. That announcement came last week. This comes after a series of events involving her former chief of staff and at least one female aide. Some are demanding that she resign. But this week, she made it clear she plans to stay put until her term ends. UConn political professor Ron Schurin gives us his thoughts on Esty's political career. Thank you for joining us here on Face the State.
Thank you for inviting me.
Is that enough for her, and what has transpired that she can hold on in office and serve out the rest of her term?
She's raised the point, which is a valid one, that if she were to resign for up to 4 months, the district would not have representation. And that's because the governor declares a special election 60 days out, but if there's a primary, then it's 60 days after that for the general. So then we go from April, May, June, July, up to August. And then you just have a few months of Congress remaining in session with the new representatives. So in that practical sense, the district would be in a difficult situation.
And she made a point of saying that in D.C. when we spoke with her, that she has to represent people in her district. At the same time, it comes with some dirty laundry.
Absolutely. And people have to decide for themselves, the voters in her district and elsewhere, was her behavior so egregious that the only appropriate response would be for her to resign several months before her term is to come to an end.
One of the things that she had said when questioned early on about this was that, she didn't actually do this, so she was not the person who was the abuser, which is true. But is it enough, and does it fly in the sense of perhaps common sense, that if someone came to you and you were aware of this situation, that you would keep that chief of staff on for another 3 months and then give him a $5,000 severance in addition to other perks involving college loans and also a very positive job recommendation?
I've been in the workforce for more than 40 years, and in several kinds of places. Universities, I started out working in a store kind of like Target. Any place I ever worked in, somebody comes to the boss and says, somebody else threatened to kill me. That boss reaches for the phone right then and there and calls the police. That's the model. Long before the Me Too movement and long before very appropriate concern with harassment, that's the behavior that most of us would expect.
And something else that I learned, and that she also admitted this, that even though he was under investigation at the time and was still her chief of staff, she took him to the Democratic convention in Philadelphia. I understand they spent thousands of dollars on hotels. So what does that say? I mean, he was under investigation at that time for the incident that happened, the death threat, and he goes off to Philadelphia with her.
I obviously don't have the answer. Congresswoman Esty is known, has long been known for her intelligence, for her courage, for her progressive positions. None of this makes any sense. And maybe at the end of the day, we will never know the answer. Congresswoman Esty's political career is probably at an end. And there we are, just facing a new election in that district.
No sooner did she announce that she will not seek re-election when all of a sudden people start coming forward. I think Mary Glassman, who was the first select woman in Simsbury, and we have a number of other candidates almost chomping at the bit. How do you, weigh in on that?
Well, there are 45 legislators in towns that are part of that district. And there are 41 towns, so 41 mayors and first select people. So there's a huge potential political field. Not all of those people are interested in running for Congress. Also, there are people who are not elected officials, including some people who have come to be known because of the Sandy Hook tragedy. And so there will be a very large group of people, which creates an interesting dynamic. You could have a primary with multiple candidates, and the winning candidate ultimately succeeding with 20–25% of the vote. That will make for an interesting race in November.
And speaking of candidates, I mean, we heard both from different parties, obviously, but Mark Barden, whose son Daniel was killed at Sandy Hook, has been who started the Sandy Hook Promise, which ironically Elizabeth Esty gave her former chief of staff a job reference there, and then Bill Pettit, who also has had a very tragic situation in his own life, and there's some speculation that he may run. And will they be one-issue candidates, do you think, or do you think that the gun issue and safety in this country is so strong that they may actually be able to make change?
When someone has experienced a tragedy of that dimension, which thankfully most of us can't even really imagine, they do get a special dimension of human understanding that might make them a stronger candidate, but more important, could make them a more effective public official. Whether they would be one-issue candidates, the model might be a congresswoman from New York, Carolyn McCarthy from Long Island, whose husband was killed on the Long Island Railroad and became a gun safety advocate, didn't like the way her congressman was acting on that issue, challenged him and won, and served for 18 years. But during her time in Congress, she branched out. She was a nurse. She became one of the leading Democratic spokesmen in some aspects of health care, was one of the few Democrats who had a piece of legislation that George Bush signed about nurses training. So she branched out from that, but still devoted herself throughout her 18 years, without as much success as she'd like, to gun safety legislation.
And as we know, Nancy Johnson was the last Republican in the 5th Congressional District. Do you think that Republicans have a shot to reclaim that district?
Of course. They have a shot, and how this will play out is dependent on a number of things, what happens in the gubernatorial race and the quality of the candidates. But one thing we do know, this is going to be a very expensive race. When Elizabeth Esty ran in 2012, or actually 2014, $4.5 million was spent in that race. And so this is a boon to the broadcasters of Connecticut.
I get to keep my job?
I guess so, yeah. So there will be a lot of attention paid and a lot of resources put into this race.
One of the things that I want to flip back to it, and you and I talked about it briefly, is with Elizabeth Esty and this whole email situation.
Yeah.
And it was so reminiscent of what happened to Hillary Clinton, and we talked about that, and still do, and that she used her personal email to work out this confidential severance deal for her former chief of staff, Tony Baker. She has said that she felt that was personal business. Do you agree with that?
I don't think it was personal business, and I'm also puzzled because at the time this all happened, the Hillary Clinton email story was a prominent story. Everyone in political circles, everyone in the country knew about that issue. So why that choice was made is one of the many puzzling aspects of this whole case.
And that's such a good point, because I think there were so many, even with the sexual harassment and abuse and the Me Too movement, you know, had this happened 30 years ago, you know, maybe people wouldn't be as on the ball, but there's so much precedent here. So you have the emails, and you remember what happened with Hillary Clinton, and the fact that we are much more aware of sexual harassment today than we ever have been before.
Absolutely, and rightly so, but this is beyond sexual harassment. When one person makes a death threat against another,
and
this is
let's
much
be
more,
clear, I mean, it really was. I mean, if someone says, I'm going to kill you, that's nothing to take lightly.
Yeah.
So what happens with those emails? Do you think that that should be pursued? Do you think she can work her way? I mean, she says that in Congress, you're only supposed to use your personal email for personal and political. But he was an employee, and taxpayers were paying his salary, and he worked in Congress.
It's an important issue, but in some ways it's one of the lesser sides of this issue. How that will play out, I'm not sure, but maybe other members of Congress will be well warned not to use personal emails for essentially official business in the future.
What about her voice in things like women's rights and the Me Too movement? Has that been damaged heavily?
Well, I think it has, and that's unfortunate because she has a lot to say. She has a lot to say on a number of issues. You may remember that she lost her seat in the General Assembly by taking a very courageous stance on capital punishment, opposing capital punishment. The New York Times, when she ran for Congress, said that's the kind of fortitude we need in Washington. Elizabeth Esty has a lot to offer, and I hope somehow or other, while her career in elective office may be over, her voice is not permanently stilled.
It is not.
I
You
hope
think
not.
that she can still do some good in the remaining months of her term?
I think that she can wage a vote in Congress and speak out on some issues, but I don't think she'll be as effective as she otherwise would have been, clearly. And then beyond her time in Congress, maybe as an active citizen, she can continue to voice concerns about the environmental and other issues that have been so important to her.
Is there anything to make of the fact that many state Democrats and Republicans called for her to resign, but her colleagues in Washington, Senator Blumenthal and Murphy and the other congressional leaders, stopped short of that?
I can only speculate that if you are a colleague of a member of Congress, you might want to voice such concerns privately, not publicly. That's just the way groups work. And I wouldn't make too much of the fact that not many public statements were made by the other members of the delegation. Perhaps they were made privately.
All right, so to recap, Esty can still do some good in office.
I think
Her
so.
political career has been damaged. Where she goes from here, who knows?
Oh, I think her political career has been more than damaged.
More
I think
than
that it's
damaged.
been probably terminated.
And as far as the 5th Congressional District, it's wide open and Republicans have a shot.
Republicans have a shot. You still have to give a little bit of an edge to the Democrats. After all, the district went for Barack Obama twice and went for Hillary Clinton by less of a margin, but still went for Hillary Clinton. Elizabeth Esty actually outpolled Hillary Clinton in her last race. So the Republicans have a bit of an uphill battle, but it is a battle that they could win.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us on Face the State.
Sure.
All right.
Thank you.
These days, it seems like everyone wants to be governor. Republican Mike Handler will join us next on why he thinks what he's done in Stamford will be the right plan for Connecticut. And we remind you, you can watch today's show and all others on our YouTube page. We'll be right back.